Hey you guys, and welcome to my grow room. Because I grow almost all of the crops in my garden from seed, and many of those are actually started indoors, I get a lot of questions on indoor seed starting. Now I could start out by giving you tips on what kind of seed starting mix to use, or how much to water, or tactical things like that. But I think for a beginner, it's really better to start out a little bit before that and talk about some common mistakes with indoor seed starting that I see especially for beginners. Now, number 3 is tactical. To me, it's a must-have. I'm gonna talk to you about grow lights, but mistakes number 1 and 2, I think are extremely common and not talked about enough. And by understanding how to avoid those mistakes, you can have a much better success rate in starting seeds indoors. Mistake number 1 I see from beginners is thinking you have to start everything from seed indoors. And the truth is, you actually don't. A lot of crops like beans and peas and corn and squash and cucumbers, they are better sown in most cases directly in your garden soil when the soil temperature has warmed up. There are a few that I always recommend getting a head start by indoor seed starting, whether that's you starting seeds indoors or whether you buy a transplant from the nursery. For cool season crops, that's always going to be broccoli and cabbage. And for warm season crops, that's going to be tomatoes and peppers. In most cases, those are crops that really do benefit from starting indoors early and then transplanting them out into the garden when the time is right. So if you're just getting started with indoor seed starting, focus on the main ones like that. Maybe it's just tomatoes and peppers. You start from there and then you expand and do more later. That's what I wish I would have done as a beginning gardener instead of worrying about starting everything from seed indoors. What I found instead is that a lot of crops like cucumbers really don't like being transplanted and are better sown directly in the garden. Mistake number 2 is starting seeds at the wrong time. Specifically, starting summer crops too early and starting spring crops too late. So let's talk about summer crops, tomatoes and peppers. In general, you're gonna wanna start your tomato seeds about 6 to 8 weeks inside before your average last frost date. For peppers, I usually start mine at the same time as tomatoes, if not a little bit earlier. They're gonna need around 8 weeks up to 12 weeks. The danger in starting either of these too early is that they're going to outgrow their container, and then you're gonna be stuck with having to pot them up into a much larger pot or put them out to the garden before the frost has passed, and then you might lose your plants altogether. So make sure and learn what your average last frost date is and then count backwards, and don't start your seeds too early, especially when it comes to the tomatoes and the peppers. Spring crops, a lot of times we start too late. These are some of the first ones that I start in my own seed starting. In fact, I already have some of my broccoli planted in the middle of January. For crops like broccoli and cabbage, and this is especially true if you live in a southern area or an area where you get hot in the summer, you definitely want to start these earlier. For me, I start these about 6 weeks before I plan to plant them out into the garden. And then when I plant them out into the garden, I plant them about 4 weeks before my average last frost date. The reason is because cabbage and broccoli and other cool season crops, they can take a frost, and most of the time they can take a freeze just fine. You may have to cover them if you have a late cold snap or something like that. But the key is to get these in the garden earlier, so that way they have a chance to mature before the heat sets in. A very common occurrence, especially in broccoli, is that you've got your broccoli growing in the spring garden and the day length is longer. And what's gonna happen is that the center of the broccoli that you're expecting a broccoli head to form, they're going to start separating and becoming flowers. And what that means is that you're not gonna get a broccoli head. And so in order to have a good broccoli head for the spring, you're going to need to plant them early. Cabbage is a little bit more forgiving when it comes to heat in my experience, but I still like to plant these about 6 weeks before I plant them out in the garden, or 10 weeks before my average last frost date. Now, I will share a caveat here. If you live in an area where your summers don't get to be that hot, you may not have to worry about this as much with cool season crops. But for gardeners like me, I'm in the southeastern US in zone 7B in Arkansas. We get hot pretty quickly in the late part of the spring and early part of the summer, so we have to get those crops in early. That way we can have a harvest before the heat sets in. Mistake number 3, I promised, is a tactical one, and to me it is of utmost importance, and that is trying to grow indoors without a grow light. I know it's the step we all want to skip. I wanted to skip it too. I wanted to grow my seedlings in a sunny south-facing window, but it never worked. Why? There's just not enough light. And when we're starting our seeds, which is often in January, February, March, the days are still pretty short. So even if you're getting that full southern sun, the daylight is not long enough. The length of the day is not enough to support that plant growth. What you'll find is leggy seedlings, and they're going to be stunted. They're not ever going to be really great producers, even if you are able to get them in the garden. Personally, it has never worked for me. And it's the most common mistake I see when people start seeds is they try to do it without a grow light. Now, the question I get asked all the time is, Jill, what kind of grow light do you use? Well, as you can see, I have kind of increased my grow light space over the years. And again, it's because I grow so many crops from seed. I don't just do tomatoes, peppers, broccoli, and cabbage anymore. I do others. But that's something I've grown into. Let me show you the grow lights that I started out with and then what I bumped up to as I gained experience to give you an idea of what you might want to start with in your garden. The grow lights I started out with are actually the ones that I still use, and these are some basic LED lights. And you can see kind of what they look like here. I'll put a link to my Amazon favorites and show you what they are. And these are ones that have lasted me 8-10 years maybe, and I still use them. I've got some broccoli right here. I'm waiting on some more broccoli seeds to plant some more. But when these start sprouting, I'll definitely lift them up closer to the light. But you can see that I have two right here, and they span the shelf pretty well. I like the LED lights. They're definitely efficient. They are sufficient for a beginning gardener. What I noticed as time went on though is that the more that I planted, the more room that I needed. And this amount of light wasn't cutting it. And that's when I decided to go to something a little bit larger and ones that could support the growing number of crops that I was starting indoors. After I outgrew the couple of LED lights that I had, I leveled up pretty significantly to this Agro Bright T5 fluorescent light. And I say significantly because I bought the long 4-foot light. My husband built me this shelf. This used to be the playroom for the kids, and now I share it with my daughter. Probably more growing than playing nowadays. But what I noticed when I switched to this Agro Bright T5 lamp is that my plants actually grew a lot faster. The LED lights were great to start out with, and like I said, I still use them, but I noticed a huge difference in the growth of my plants when I use these. Another difference between the LED and the Agro Bright is the heat. The LEDs do not cast any heat at all, whereas these get pretty hot. So you have to watch that, especially when it comes to the soil moisture. I definitely have to water my plants when they are under this light more compared to when they're under the LED light. But this is what I expanded to several years ago, and I liked it so well that as my operation continued to expand, I actually bought more of these, but in the smaller length, which may be actually more appropriate for you. This year, as I continued to expand, I wanted to make better use of this wire shelf, and so I bought this Agro Bright T5 fluorescent. It's the same thing as the other one you just saw, except it's 2 feet. So it's actually perfect to go on one of these wire shelves. This is actually a very popular setup. It's a lot less work and more inexpensive than the shelf that my husband built me. And that's why I wanted to show this to you, because I feel like this is a great option. I have celery planted here, which is one of those crops that once I started growing it indoors. And just to note, once the celery actually sprouts, I will definitely have it much closer to the light. I'll probably stack it on some books or something for now, because I don't have this one where it can go up and down. Whereas the 4-foot one, I do have where it can go up and down depending on the growth of the plant. That's another question I get asked a lot. How close do the lights need to be? In most cases, the lights are going to need to be just a few inches above the top of the plants, but check out your light. Watch your plants. Some don't have to be that close, but these lights always do. Now, I know that purchasing a grow light is an investment, especially a larger one. The LEDs, if you want to get started, they're not that expensive. But I will have to say that the more that you start seed indoors, the more plants that you grow, it definitely ends up paying off in the long run because of not having to buy those expensive transplants. So if gardening is definitely something that you want to do for long term, I highly recommend investing in a grow light. And if you don't, for the crops that need to be started indoors, buy transplants. Don't worry about starting from seed indoors. That's totally okay. I don't want you to waste your time and your effort just to be disappointed. Just know that you can always grow into starting seeds indoors if this year isn't the time that you want to start. But if you are ready to take the plunge and start indoor seed starting, it is so much fun and I definitely recommend it if you're ready for it. But you need a little bit of guidance on when to start what, when to start seeds indoors, when to plant them out in the garden. I have a free guide for you in the description. It's a seed starting quick reference guide. Check that out, download it, and that'll give you a good start on some of the most basic crops. It'll help you know what to plant indoors and what to directly sow in the garden and when to transplant those crops out. It's the free seed starting quick reference guide. It's in the description, so check that out. And as you can see, I just started my process this year of growing seeds indoors. If you want to see more of my process, when I start and how it all goes, what I choose to plant in, and all of those things, make sure to like and subscribe for more garden videos this season. I look forward to gardening with you, and I'll see you on the next episode.